Multi-hazards, all affecting communities.
Wildfire smoke is no joke. How can we protect our communities from its harm, even as the climate changes and wildfires increase? Join Dr. Sarah Henderson, renowned scientist in environmental public health, and me, Multi-Hazards podcast host Vin Nelson, as we discuss how we can adapt to the polluted skies as more wildfires engulf our forests and living spaces. Have a listen. Hello, dear listeners. This episode is where I have a great conversation with scientist Dr. Sarah Henderson. But first, let's give a territorial acknowledgement. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Stalo, aka Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Quiquetlam peoples. These are the names of the excellent First Nations groups who have inhabited this land since time immemorial, this area near me, also known as Greater Vancouver, here on the west coast of Canada. So my guest for today is Dr. Sarah Henderson. She is the Scientific Director in Environmental Health Services at the BC Centre for Disease Control, BCCDC. She is also an Associate Professor in the University of British Columbia, or UBC, School of Population and Public Health. Sarah Henderson started her career as an environmental engineer. She has a Bachelor of Science from UBC from the year 2000, working on pollution abatement and control. She switched her focus to environmental epidemiology, so she has a PhD from UBC from 2009, where she first became interested in the public health consequences of engineering decisions. Sarah joined the BC Centre for Disease Control in 2010. So, without further ado, let's get to the interview. Hello, listeners. Another Multi-Hazards podcast here, and today we feature Sarah Henderson, Dr. Sarah Henderson, from the BC Centre for Disease Control. It's called the BCCDC, and she's also a professor at the University of British Columbia, or UBC. So it's great to have you on the show, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Vin.
How has your week been?
Oh, it's been a busy one. We've had extreme hot weather in the province. We've got lots of wildfire smoke in the province. So all the things that I do professionally are kind of piling up here.
That's right. Summer is your peak season, it sounds like.
Sure is.
Now, today we're discussing wildfire smoke. And I was reading, I think I heard CBC News earlier this week. It said that the whole of Canada, or at least from parts of British Columbia all the way to Ontario, were covered in wildfire smoke. And in Metro Vancouver, where we both are right now, we're kind of fortunate, but it's a very big topic of concern besides the wildfires themselves. And it is becoming like a seasonal crisis where we can expect that it's going to come every year. And it really affects people, especially vulnerable, who are very young, very old, who have other health problems, etc. So, Sarah, let's just start and talk about, this really strange year we've had. It's the pandemic, and what is it, a year and a half. So I'm just wondering how you've been surviving with the pandemic.
Well, I do work at the BCCDC, and it really was all hands on deck for the response to the pandemic. So even though I'm an environmental epidemiologist, I had to become infectious disease epidemiologist for a while to help out with that response. So, I was really hoping for a mellower summer so that we could have a little bit of time to relax. It's been very long hours for months on end. Alas, things have not gone that way. So I would say I'm tired, but I guess at least back in the comfort zone of working in the area that I'm familiar with, which is environmental health.
Right, exactly. Yes, a tough year, and they've been working you very hard. So now I'm just wondering, how did you become a go-to person for wildfire smoke?
Yeah. after the 2003 wildfires in BC, which were considered to be very severe at that time, though in retrospect, that looks like kind of a mild season now. I was starting my PhD at the same time, and I was planning to study the impacts of emissions from oil refineries in Canada. That's kind of my background, environmental engineering. But I saw that smoke and I thought, wow, that's a really interesting exposure. I wonder, what health effects it has. And there was very little evidence in the peer-reviewed literature at that time. So, I just kind of started working on it, and I've been working on it ever since. I do find wildfire smoke fascinating.
Right. I remember, I think it was 2 or 3 summers ago, I started going on to Google Scholar and reading all the articles. And I think trauma was starting to set in after a couple of weeks, because it was the deeper I got, it just like, it seemed endless, the things that it can do to you. So, wow. Now, wildfires, as we can see this season, they're just becoming more and more frequent in many, many countries. And of course, we should be concerned with it. So I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on this new reality of more frequent and more severe wildfires.
I can elaborate as much as possible. We're in a strange situation in Western North America, particularly. We didn't want fire for a really long time, so we tried to exclude it from the landscape. And this is a naturally flammable landscape. Wildfire would regularly move through. It's just part of the ecologic process. So the fact that we suppressed those fires for a very long time, decades and decades, meant that there's sort of an unnatural buildup of fuel on the landscape. That was always going to be problematic when it came to wildfire, but then that buildup is being combined with a change in climate, where we're seeing longer, drier, hotter, windier summers, which is all the kinds of conditions that wildfires love. So we have these two problems that are kind of coming together in time and creating these extremely severe seasons. And we never know exactly what any given wildfire season is going to bring. But at this point, I caution everyone to prepare for the worst wildfire we've ever seen every year, because, we had 2017, and I think a lot of people kind of thought, well, that's done now. We've had our 100-year wildfire season, and then we had a worse wildfire season the following year. So we just have to understand that the landscape is incredibly flammable for these two different reasons, and that we may just continue to see these increasingly severe seasons.
Right. Now, you mentioned climate change, and I cringe when it's like we have to prove climate change every time there's a new disaster, right? And it often gets blamed for things that may not even be all climate change, as you were saying, like the mismanagement, we could say, of the forests. Like, for example, all the stuff that's on the ground of the forest, it should have been controlled, burned over time, but it wasn't. So now climate change is a huge factor, though. Am I correct?
Climate change is a huge factor. We'll never know, if we'd manage forests differently, how the climate change situation would be playing out in the counterfactual forest. But climate change is a huge factor in this. There's no doubt in my mind. I don't need to do attribution studies to state that with confidence.
Right. And people don't have to get onto Google Scholar now. They can just kind of look outdoors for a few days or a few weeks. And then you could just...
we're sitting at the longest period ever with no rain in recorded history for this region. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, it has really, really changed. So now with wildfire smoke, it affects public health in many, many ways. And so I'm just wondering, let's be basic here, but what exactly is wildfire smoke compared to other kinds of smoke?
Wildfire smoke is never the same thing twice. It's an extremely complex form of air pollution, and fundamentally, it's a mixture of gases and small particles. but the gases that are in there and the composition of the small particles that's in there is going to depend very heavily on what's burning, what the meteorological conditions are, how dry the fuel is. It really comes down to completeness of combustion. So whether or not we have a flaming, very hot fire or a smoldering, cooler temperature fire. Regardless, I always tell people you could grab a sample of smoke from a fire and 10 minutes later grab another sample and do chemical analysis on them and find two totally different things. It's just so dynamic that we can never really predict what's going to be there. And that makes it different from other types of pollution and smoke or emissions from burning sources, because on average we kind of know what's going to come out of a car and we kind of know what's going to come out of an industrial site. Like, it changes a little bit over time, but it's very predictable in comparison, and wildfire smoke is absolutely not predictable.
Right.
The
Exactly.
primary concern, like from a health perspective, is those small particles. I mean, there's other things there, but the small particles are the big deal.
Right. Now, I don't know if this is in typical media language, public language, but I've seen other terms: wildland fire smoke and then landscape fire smoke, LFS. So I think there's a whole bunch of different terms for the same thing bandying around. Am I right?
Yeah. We're concerned about fire on the landscape. Sometimes that fire is deliberately set. Sometimes that fire is on agricultural land. Sometimes, in many places around the world, it's actually for deforestation. So you have a huge amount of forest burning, but somebody lit it on fire to make it burn to clear space for agriculture or what have you. From the broader perspective, smoke from those types of fires is a very similar sort of thing. So technically we refer to it as landscape fire smoke. But in Canada, for the most part, what we have is wildfire smoke.
Wildfire smoke. And in Australia, they say bushfire smoke. So.
Yeah, and that's just terminology. They say that in the UK as well.
Okay. Now, how about wildfire smoke? How do we measure it in terms of air quality?
Well, again, we measure these very small particles. So particles less than 2.5 microns in aerodynamic diameter. That's the thing that we all want to talk about. And we measure that in lots of different places because we already knew that was bad for human health. We knew from air pollution literature, from highly polluted urban environments, and from all kinds, thousands upon thousands of studies that tell us that's not good for humans. So, we because of that, we've really tried to regulate how much fine particulate matter is in the air, especially in high-income countries. So we measure it everywhere to make sure that we're in compliance with the laws of how much can be there. There's a lot of stuff in smoke that we don't measure. So we use PM 2.5 as kind of a proxy for what is a really more complicated mixture. We don't measure volatile organic compounds all over the place with the same kind of instrumentation. We don't measure PAHs everywhere. There's all these things in smoke that we simply don't measure, and we need to use the PM 2.5 to kind of stand in for the whole thing.
Right. And who measures these things? Like, do you have a lab where you are working, or?
There are air quality monitoring stations located all over Canada, run by Environment and Climate Change Canada and provincial partners, to make sure that our air quality is good and to make sure that we're, improving air quality all the time. There's regulations that change every 5 years that are always trying to improve air quality. So, we do pay careful attention to that because we're trying to have better air quality in Canada and throughout much of the world, because we know that air pollution is bad for human health.
Right. But do people or your agencies, do they grab any wildfire smoke and analyze it, or is that kind of a waste of time?
No, it's not a waste of time. So the typical, the air quality monitoring stations that are located around the country, they're grabbing small samples all of the time and trying to measure the amounts of fine particles in them. There's also sort of more academic type studies where people might go out with a canister, like a vacuum canister, and grab a sample of smoke out of the smoke plume. And increasingly, there's a couple of big studies where they're flying planes through the smoke plumes to sort of measure the smoke directly in the atmosphere to see what's in there.
Okay. Wow. That's a big field there. Have you heard of purple air?
Of course.
Okay. I thought it was a quite an interesting way of kind of getting these monitors all over the place and then gathering
so
the data.
These low cost sensors, the ones that Environment and Climate Change Canada use, is a very sophisticated sensor, and it has to meet certain standards. And they're really expensive. They cost tens of thousands of dollars each. The purple air is a low cost sensor, which makes it relatively affordable, maybe a couple $100 for individuals to buy. It uses quite a different technology. It just shines light or at the air and sees how much light bounces back, and then estimates how many particles are in the air based on the bounce back. So they're not really accurate the way the Environment Canada ones are, but they're affordable, and that means we can have them in lots of different locations.
Right. And just for our listeners to know, Purple Air, it's this website, and then they have these little monitors, and I think you can buy it off the website for $200. And I remember looking at the map sometimes. It's very helpful, but once in a while you'll see one neighborhood that's got this sky high bad air, and you're wondering, there's no fires around, there's nothing. Like, what is it? Is it just like they're right parked beside a factory or something? So yeah.
It can be. I mean, we have a lot of places in Canada that are also quite heavily impacted by residential wood burning during the winter months as well. So if you live in a neighborhood where lots of people are burning wood to heat their homes, you can have quite significant air quality impacts from that too.
Right. Now, we're concerned, I think, a lot about the short-term and long-term health impacts of wildfire smoke. So I'm wondering, in the beginning, if you could just tell us, what are the short-term health impacts?
When you breathe these very small particles into your lungs, they can cause local inflammation, and they also cause irritation. But the inflammation is probably the most important thing. And it's a foreign body in your lungs, and your immune response system reacts to it that way. So, if you had a foreign bacterium or a foreign virus in your lungs, your body's going to do things to try to go in and kill that bacteria or that virus. It has the same response to these small particles, but it can't kill them because they're not alive. So this sustained immunological response leads to inflammation in the lungs, and that inflammation in the lungs actually spills over into the entire body. So it leads to systemic inflammation in the body. For some people, that's really not going to cause, to be subclinical. That's what we call it. It doesn't make them feel anything. It's happening. If I drew your blood, I might see an indicator that inflammation was happening, but you feel fine. For others, it's a different story. And for people with respiratory diseases such as asthma or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, where they have these really reactive airways that just want to close up all the time, that inflammation and then maybe irritation from the other gases that are in wildfire smoke can be quite problematic, because it might affect their ability to breathe. For people who have underlying heart conditions, that inflammation may initiate a severe cardiovascular event, such as a heart attack. I often say people learn that they have heart disease when it gets smoky. So they've had subclinical heart disease that hasn't troubled them too much. They don't actually know they have heart disease. And then the smoke initiates a cardiovascular event that makes them realize that heart disease is there. And for people with conditions such as diabetes, that inflammation wreaks a little bit of havoc on the endocrine system, so hormones and everything, and that makes it difficult for them to balance their insulin levels. So there's kind of all these knock-on effects that people can have.
Right. Now, I guess there's three parts to the short term. One is like you can treat it at home. The second is you got to go see your family doctor. And the third one is you got to go to emergency. So I'm just wondering, are there different reactions you should have to the impact of
Yeah,
wildfire
it
smoke?
depends on the level of, lots of people will have symptoms that are annoying. I will have a headache. Some people will have a little bit of a cough or an itchy throat, stuff that you're just going to push through and you'll be fine when the smoke clears. If you're having difficulty breathing or heart palpitations, then you do need to seek emergency medical care. If you have a condition such as asthma and you're having a hard time getting your asthma under control, your rescue medications aren't working the way they normally do, you're not getting your breathing back the way you like it, then you need to seek medical attention for sure.
Right. And so long term, you were already telling me few of the effects, but I guess it can be quite complicated. And then plus, if somebody's had COVID or something else, makes it, what do we call it? It's kind of snowball effect.
Yeah, we don't really know because we're starting to have these severe seasons kind of year in and year out. We're going to have a lot of opportunity to look at what the longer term impacts of these seasons are on the health of the population. At this point, my primary concerns are people who have pre-existing conditions. What smoke might do is sort of progress that condition a little bit faster than it would have gone if the smoke wasn't there. So say you have a degenerative lung condition such as COPD, and you have a really bad wildfire season, well, maybe that progresses your COPD further than a nice summer would have progressed it. So there's that kind of one side of the equation. The other side where, I think we really need to pay a lot of attention as a country is what happens if you're exposed to smoke in utero? What happens if you're exposed to smoke when you're newborn? What happens if you're exposed to smoke when you're 2 years old? All of these times in life when the lungs are developing and branching, and damage to the lung may actually have lifelong health consequences for that individual. So that's really where I'm trying to focus my research right now. And I think a lot of other teams around the world are digging into that problem too.
Right. That's so very important. Now, other groups who are vulnerable to the smoke could be, say, pregnant women or older people, or, for example, essential workers who are forced to be in it all the time.
Yeah. So, anybody who works outdoors is going to be more exposed, especially if they have a hard job and their respiration rate is elevated. If they're exerting themselves outdoors, they have to breathe even more smoke. Anybody with any kind of condition that compromises their health on a day-to-day basis on a good day is going to be more sensitive to those smoky conditions when they occur. Older adults, your lung function, a lot of older adults are starting to have chronic diseases as well, but your lung function also just decreases. Your lungs get a little less stretchy as you get older, so you can't take in quite as much air, and that smoke may be a bigger risk factor. And yeah, as you said, women who are pregnant, children, infants, all, everything around infants and children who are developing is an area for concern.
Right. So there's a lot of research that still needs to be done.
So much research.
Right. Now, I'm wondering about prescribed burns because, for example, there's a PhD student at UBC right now, already a postdoctorate, and she was studied on one of the islands off of BC here that First Nations had actually done prescribed or controlled burns, even like a few hundred years ago when she found it on the tree rings. And I thought that was fascinating, but it was like a regular practice for Indigenous people here in BC. And then we've had all these years where we haven't done it as much. But I'm thinking, what happens if we all of a sudden said, let's start doing prescribed burns to minimize this wildfire season? But then you've got the smoke, right? So I'm just wondering, is there a way that we can organize it so that the smoke won't be so harmful? Or do you have any ideas on that?
It's a really tough question when we're talking about prescribed burning, because you're right. Indigenous people on the landscape in North America did burn the land regularly to help shape it and to help maintain it. and we've stopped those types of practices. We've suppressed fire. There's growing recognition that putting prescribed fire back on the landscape will work to reduce wildfire risk. It's not going to eliminate wildfires. We can't prescribe burn our way out of the wildfire risk situation, but we may be able to make some gains with respect to wildfire risk. Smoke is smoke is smoke. Like, none of it is good for human health. So although I'll talk to fire people and they'll distinguish good fire from bad fire, there's no good smoke and there's bad smoke. There's just smoke, and it's not good for humans. The thing about prescribed fire versus wildfire is that you do have control over when you burn. So you can look for those days where you know the smoke's going to rise out of the atmosphere, it's not going to pool in the valleys. You can tell people in advance, we're going to do this prescribed burning. So close your windows and get your air cleaner running, because it might be a little bit smoky for a few days. Prescribed burns tend not to cause really big smoke events the way that wildfire does. So the magnitude of the air quality impacts is usually lesser. So there are some advantages to the smoke that comes from prescribed burning, but I'm not going to say, yeah, that's really healthy for people, because it's not.
Okay. Now, I remember a couple years ago, I went on to a webinar, and I think it was the state of California, and they were talking about some occupational health and safety new rules, particularly for wildfire smoke. And I haven't actually caught up on our WorkSafe BC here in our province, but I'm just wondering about these people, as we were talking about, they're kind of forced in a way to be outside and working in the smoke. So, or people who have to travel from A to B during the day when it's smoky. So
yeah, so California has enacted some quite protective rules for workers related to working in wildfire smoke, and Washington state is on the precipice of doing the same thing. We haven't done that in BC, but there's widespread recognition of WorkSafe that wildfire smoke is a potential occupational hazard. It's challenging. I mean, there's a couple of different things you can do to try to protect people who are working outdoors, but the best thing is don't make them work outdoors. That's not always an option. So then we do need to look at what is effective respiratory protection, what is really going to reduce the amount of small particles that get into the lungs of these people who are having to work outdoors during these very smoky conditions. And that's talking respirators. There are very effective respirators out there that do a great job of reducing the amount of particles that people breathe. They're actually more widely available on the market because of COVID. You'll see your KN95 in your London drugs. You know, we didn't see that before COVID. And those can really help to protect people if they do absolutely need to be working outdoors when it's smoky.
Right. I remember one part of that webinar I'd taken, they were talking about, like, how do you enforce any new rules anyways? Like, you can't have millions of inspectors driving around and just looking at all the construction sites. So that was seemed to be a complication there. So
yeah, that's always true for occupational health and safety rules. There aren't a million inspectors out there who can inspect, you know, everything at all times. So the rule exists. The fact that the rule exists in and of itself is helpful because it brings attention to the fact that this is an occupational health hazard. But how, you know, employers use those rules really does end up being kind of on an individual by individual basis.
Right. And during this past heat wave that we had a month ago, I was actually a little bit happy to see that some workplaces let their workers like not come to work on those days, and especially outdoor workers. So it seems that their awareness for these kind of hazards is getting more and more for the employer. So
you know, I agree with you. I was really amazed how many employers were willing to say we're shut down for the day, and I kind of wonder how much COVID had factored into that. Like, maybe it has normalized this idea that, well, if it's not safe, we don't do this today. And I hope that is something that, you know, will continue into the future.
Right. And it's quite amazing sometimes. So Now, I wonder about indoors. And I think I heard one of your recent, maybe a month ago, YouTube videos, and you were talking about the smoke that is something like it takes an hour or two to seep its way into our home. So I'm wondering, what can we do about indoors?
Yeah, it doesn't take very long. Most of us spend most of our time indoors, so it is really important to think about the indoor environment, because honestly, that's where most of us will be exposed to smoke, is inside, because we're inside 90% of the time. The best things you can do are figure out how to keep smoke out of your house, and then how to clean smoke out that does happen to get in. So keeping smoke out means closing windows and doors, checking the seals on those windows and doors, wandering around to see where there's little drafts coming in, because wherever there's a little draft coming in, the smoke isn't coming in with it. And then running a portable air cleaner, either in one room or one area of the house, to clean that smoke out and keep it as smoke-free as possible. This all becomes a little bit problematic if it's also going to be extremely hot. In general, overheating indoors is going to be a bigger risk factor for people than inhaling wildfire smoke. So, don't shut yourself up in a really hot house and make yourself too hot, because that's a more immediate risk to your well-being than the smoke exposure for most people.
Right. Like a couple summers ago, I went and invested in 2 purifiers, and they're costly, maybe 100 something, not too bad. But recently it's like, oh, I need an air conditioner for our place, and it's like, can't buy them right now. We're gonna have to wait till maybe winter time. So it's these 2 things, the heat and the smoke, we got to start worrying about. So
yeah, well, you are a multi-hazard podcast, and we are really seeing with climate change these multi-hazard situations stack up on top of each other, and sometimes the best thing to do for one of the hazards is the worst thing to do for the other hazards. So we need to prioritize how we're going to respond.
right. Now, you mentioned in, I think it was a global news video that you had done, Sarah, about a DIY air purifier, and you could just do it and it's low cost. So I'm wondering if you could tell us about that.
Oh yeah. So turns out you can take a 20-inch by 20-inch box fan and tape a high quality 20-inch by 20-inch furnace filter to the back of it and have a pretty effective little do-it-yourself air cleaner. It's not going to work in a big room, but in a small room, maybe 100 square feet, it can be quite effective. And we tested these. One of my colleagues at UBC has an exposure booth where they expose individuals to test physiological effects of air pollution, but it was all shut down during COVID. So we were allowed to, go in there and test whether or not these things actually work. And they do. It turns out they work quite well. The one caution is that, a box fan is not designed to run with a filter on the back of it. It's not what it's for. And it does put a little extra strain on the motor. And we did note that the motor temperature of the fan increases when that filter is there. So, don't leave this running unattended, because there is, the potential for a fire hazard because of that extra burden on the motor.
Right. Okay. Now, I think I saw also online, I think you've been up to Prince George, which is in the north of British Columbia, but there was this fellow and he was doing these workshops for people to, I think it's called airtight your house, or get your house airtight, so the smoke doesn't seep in under the door or over the door or other place. I wonder if you've heard about that.
I haven't heard about that, but it's, it's a good idea in the Canadian winter anyhow, because it'll help to retain heat. All of the things that you would do to retain heat in the winter will also keep smoke out in the summer. So it really is kind of understanding all of the places in your house where smoke may come in. And then really, one of the key things is every time you open the door to leave the house, whole wave of smoke is going to come in. And just to be aware of that, and maybe keep your air cleaner somewhere near to that door so that it's cleaning out that smoke right away when it does get in.
Right. Now, a couple of years ago, I was taking a program in exercise design for emergencies, and I made my practicum, or what was it, the capstone, about what happens if we had extreme wildfire smoke where it was just like, you have to gather up the homeless people outside, put them into a clean air shelter, and we'd have to sort of a worst case scenario. And it was probably really unrealistic, but I was just wondering about this concept of community clean air shelters.
I'm going to start by saying that this is a challenging thing to communicate, but the health risks associated with wildfire smoke exposure start as soon as there is smoke in the air. Like as soon as it gets smoky, there is health risk associated with that smoke. And then it's actually not a linear function of how bad the smoke is. It really plateaus after a while. So it's very tempting and understandable that people believe that the worse the smoke is, the worse it is for your health, but that's not actually true.
Wow.
It's really as the smoke is starting to build in that first 100 micrograms per meter cubed of PM 2.5 where most of the health risk is. In terms of community cleaner air shelters, they have a role to serve for sure. And there are lots of, bigger buildings tend to be more resilient to smoke. So your shopping malls and your community centers, they can take some pretty simple steps to make those indoor environments more comfortable than the outdoor environment. Even still, I've seen situations where contractors have gone whole hog on a building. They've put better filters in the air intakes. They have air cleaners throughout the building, and there's way less smoke inside than there is outside. There's still a lot of smoke inside. So, it's cleaner air quality for sure compared with what's happening outdoors, but on a day-to-day basis, it would still be considered very poor air quality. So, smoke gets in and you can't necessarily keep it from getting in. It's good to have these facilities in the community, but most of us want to go home and sleep in our bedroom at night for 8 hours or, slightly less if you're me or slightly more if you're other people. And those 8 hours, if you can keep your bedroom cleaner, you've gone a long way to protecting yourself for a third of the day.
Okay, sorry. You were giving me kind of apocalyptic science fiction movie scenarios in my mind where people almost have to have astronaut suits to get all of that stuff out and not into your body. But
it's about reducing exposure, right? It's as low as reasonably achievable. ALERA is a concept that we talk about a lot in occupational and environmental health. And that's really what we're looking for is, okay, it's really bad outside. How good can we make it inside in comparison? Because it's still going to be better and protective to be inside compared with outside.
Right. I actually had a guest, and I can't remember which one, who told me that he had been working at the funeral home and his job was to look at bodies after. And he said that people who grow up in the city, typically they will find out that it wasn't the funeral, it was the coroner. Anyways, they found out that the lungs for city people were pretty bad, upon death. But then people who grow up in the mountains and way far away, some places are really good. So I guess no matter what we city people do, we're going to have kind of the lungs with a lot of stuff in it.
Yeah. Living in an urban environment comes with air pollution exposure. We're really lucky in Canada. We have incredibly good urban air quality throughout most of the country compared with many other places in the world. But still, we breathe pollution all through our lives for sure.
Right. Now, what about driving? Because we do spend a lot of time driving, but the price of gas goes up. Maybe we spend less time driving. But in the car, apparently we can use our air conditioner, I think. And then there's this filter near the glove compartment. It's called a cabin filter. So I was just wondering if you know about that.
Yeah, so the typical advice is to put the air on, recirculate in your car and close your windows and turn your air conditioning on if you have air conditioning, and the air in the cab of the car is going to get recirculated through that little filter. It depends. The quality of that little filter does depend. It's not necessarily, HEPA level filtration. Some of them are better than others. So if you are concerned and you do a lot of driving and smoke, you should, think about the filter that's in there and think about replacing it with something that's higher, a higher level of filtration.
Okay, great. Now, wondering about websites for, say, air quality, and then some that may be specifically for wildfire smoke. Are there these out there?
There's many out there. There's a couple I use religiously. First, I have the Air Quality and Health Index app on my phone, and it alerts me whenever any station in BC goes above a level of 7, it alerts me because I follow all of the stations in BC. So that's a really quick way to get some information. I also have the Weather Can app on my phone, which is the Environment Canada weather app. And whenever a special air quality statement or an air quality advisory is issued, that pops up for any region that you follow. So you get that information right on your phone right away.
Okay. And yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I'm not done. There's more.
Okay, yeah. Go ahead.
So I don't really follow websites so much. I use those apps, but the website I look at daily or multiple times daily at this time of year is the Fireworks Smoke Forecast from Environment Canada, which just shows you an animation of what the smoke is expected to do over the next 3 days and kind of gives you a sense, like, for the last several weeks in BC, we've had this strong wind out of the west. So smoke has been blowing eastward and elsewhere across the country. But as you've noted, in the Lower Mainland, we haven't had much exposure because the wind hasn't turned around. We might have a different wind system come through, and that app is going to show you that we're expecting a change in the winds and we're expecting the smoke to go in another direction.
Right. Okay. It's funny because we used to say there's an app for that to everything, but I found out that sometimes the phone can get like too many apps, right? And then you end up not really using them like you should. So I still sometimes use websites. So
there's websites for the AQHI as well. Yeah.
Right. Now there's this one too. I don't know if you heard of it. It's called Firesmoke.ca. Is it something new, or have you heard of that?
No, so Firesmoke.ca is a different forecast. It's run out of UBC. And it's like I use the firework forecast usually, but Firesmoke, that's the blue sky forecast. It's another forecasting system. Really looking at both of them will provide even more information. There's an effort out of Environment Canada right now to actually, so when we have weather models, we don't run a single weather model and say this is what the weather is going to be. There's tens of models that get run, and then they report on an ensemble of those models. So they take the average of multiple models as probably the thing that most represents what's actually going to happen. And now they're starting to ensemble the smoke models together. So it's not just a single model. We get information from 5 or 6 different smoke models together in one place, and therefore probably get a better prediction of what's actually going to happen.
Okay. And then I hope we can trust some of the local weather websites or apps, for example, like the Weather Network and things like that?
Yeah, all of those places. In BC, we have Smoky Skies bulletins, and you can sign up for that subscription service by text or by email. And whenever, smoke is expected in your area within the next couple of days, you'll get this bulletin in advance saying it's probably going to get smoky there. I mean, it's not a sure thing, but it's other people integrating that information from all these different sources and saying, hey, it's probably going to be smoky in this region.
Okay. Now, Sarah, you alluded already to the fact that COVID-19 has got us used to masks. And it's funny because for me, I went out when I learned about wildfire smoke and I bought some packages of these N95 masks. So and then it kind of sat for a whole year, and then COVID came. It's like, wow, now I get to use them. And it's funny. And then you see some people, especially from Asia, and they were walking around with masks maybe say 10 years ago, and everybody's looking like, oh, how weird is that? But just this normalizing of using masks, I'm just wondering, like it will really benefit just that psychological barrier that it's been broken down and people will mask up when they see the need.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that concerns me most is that masks will be seen as the solution to wildfire smoke, and they're not. better indoor air quality is the solution to wildfire smoke, and masks are a supplement to that solution. So there's all kinds of reasons why it makes good sense to wear a protective mask when it's smoky outside. If you don't feel that you need that protection, that's fine. But if you feel that that extra layer of filtering of the outdoor air is going to be useful to you, then wear a mask. And I've always suggested that it's a good idea to try to wear some respiratory protection outdoors when it's smoky, but please don't tell people to wear masks inside their homes. Please give them the information they need to try to keep smoke out of their homes so that they can live comfortably and mask free.
Right.
Also can't sleep. You can't sleep in a mask. That's just dangerous. So, I just can't see this as the solution to the problem. It's a nice supplement.
Right. Because you don't want people to be like overbold and it's like, I'll put on my mask and I'll be like a superhero. So.
Oh yeah. I mean, I've definitely seen people out, like doing hardcore exercise in their N95s. Like, you should just take it easy for today.
Right. That's me on Burnaby Mountain sometimes. Yeah. Now, I had a podcast a week ago, and it was Dr. Ilan Kelman, and he's from University College London. And so there was something he said, and he said, aiming to avert disaster is a continual year-round task, and it works. So there was this image of, say, athletes who have on-season and off-season. So I was just wondering, can we do that with wildfire smoke and the other things that come in the summer? We kind of have like a 3-month preparation time, say in the spring, where we get ready for these things that are coming up. And maybe it could be a public thing where we all talk about it and it just becomes part of our culture.
Yeah, so this is a real pet project of mine, I guess, is to develop that kind of thing. So the first week of April is Wildfire Smoke Preparedness Week, or what have you. We have a day in October where we all climb under our desks for a bit in case there's going to be an earthquake. It's October the 4th. I can't remember what Earthquake Preparedness Day is, but we haven't had an earthquake for a long time. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but why don't we give the same amount of attention to a disaster that unfolds, annually at this point? So I really try to start talking about smoke in the pre-season, and that is April as far as I'm concerned at this point in time. And I try to say to reporters and other media people whenever I speak to them, please do a story next year in April. It's always, we're always talking to people about how to protect themselves when it's already really smoky outside. And you had this experience with the air conditioner. You went and you couldn't get one when it was super hot. People go and they can't get an air cleaner when it's super smoky. But maybe if they picked one up in April, there wouldn't be that demand in the market and they'd have that on hand when it got smoky in July or August. So I absolutely think that this is the way we need to start talking about things like wildfire smoke and extreme hot weather. We need to talk about them months before they happen and get that people thinking about what they're going to do when these conditions arise.
Right. And we can get like the corporations and Walmart, Home Depot, Canadian Tire, all these companies on board. It's sort of like preparing your clothing for the next season.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, this is Wildfire Smoke Preparedness Week, 20% off all portable air cleaners, like it's a win-win situation.
Right. Exactly. So now we've come to the end of our podcast and it's been a real pleasure. And I'm wondering, do you have a final message that you would like to leave ringing in the audience's ears, Sarah?
Go into every wildfire season expecting that it may be the worst wildfire season we've ever seen. People talk about the new normal when it comes to wildfire season and climate change. I like to talk about the new abnormal. We just cannot expect that precedent will define what can happen in the future. So the best way to, the best offense is a good defense. Go into to that season thinking it's going to be worse than anything we've ever seen before, and prepare for that. Because if you're prepared for that, then hopefully you're prepared for less than that. And it's just, it's not optimistic, it's not pessimistic. It's just realistic, I think.
Right. And it's good to prepare for your mental health. You'll feel more confident going into whatever season's coming up, right?
There's so much evidence to show that people who have a plan going into a disaster do better. Their mental health does better, their physical health does better. That self-sufficiency and equipping yourself with the information and the tools that you need to cope really does pay off in the long run.
Right. Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate it. This is Dr. Sarah Henderson, and she's from I always get it hard to say, the BCCDC, so the British Columbia Center for Disease Control, and you're also professor at UBC. And yeah, this is so much great knowledge for everybody. And I hope, as I said before, this becomes part of the culture, and that public education, it just becomes more and more. So thank you so much, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Vince. It's been fun.
Okay. Have a great weekend. Take care.
Yeah, you too.
And that's it. Wow. A big shout out to my awesome guest, Dr. Sarah Henderson, for joining me here today. So, an important disclaimer here. First, this podcast is meant to be educational and does not try to offer legal, medical, or other specific professional or expert advice unless otherwise noted. Second, the opinions that we express here today, either myself or my guests, they don't necessarily reflect those of the organizations that we work with. Here as I conclude this episode, thanks to you once again, precious listeners, for joining us here today. Stay safe out there and stay tuned for more episodes. This is Vin Nelson wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. Cheers to you all. Peace out.